pleasure for me to introduce and say a few words about our two wonderful speakers at this evening's event at the Asiatic Library. The event itself is part of a very attractive intellectual program that the Infosys Science Foundation has constructed in recent years. As some of you may know, that foundation awards an annual prize to 6 scholars whom it selects from universities in the world over as the most distinguished scholars under the age of 40 in a wide range of disciplines. And it asks each prize winner to take a sabbatical for a month to give lectures and seminars in various institutions in India of her or his choosing. One of our speakers this evening, Mahmood Kooria, was awarded this prize last year in the Humanities and Social Sciences, and he has chosen the Asiatic Society as the site for one of these seminars, and has chosen and has particularly asked that Amitav Ghosh be invited to be his interlocutor, an invitation which, with his characteristic generosity, Amitav has accepted. So that explains why we are all gathered here this evening at this Ringirum Darbar Hall at the Asiatic Society. The prize was given to Mahmood for his outstanding scholarly work on maritime Islam. It has been known for long that when Islam came to India, it acquired in its passage over Persia, Central Asia, and Afghanistan accretions in doctrine and practice, and these sedimented in further deeply transforming local roots in the cultures of India, which it came to inhabit. But there were as well watery oceanic highways which connected Islam to South Asia and yet further east. And ever since K.N. Chaudhary's influential work, these have been the subject of careful and illuminating scholarship, none more careful illuminating than Mahmood Kooria's. To keep things very brief, I'll only mention his major work among his increasingly large corpus of writing, his book Islamic Law in Circulation, in which he brilliantly elaborates the processes of the globalization across the Indian Ocean rim from the 13th century to our own time. One of the 4 major schools of jurisprudence in Sunni Islam that owes to one of the earliest Islamic jurists and theologians, Al-Shafi, culminating in what he has memorably summed up with the phrase, echoing Sheldon Pollock, the Shafi cosmopolis. Let me try and convey to you one kind of steep demand on his kind of scholarship that he so admirably fulfilled. The vastly complex and diverse properties of most of the religions we know fall under 2 broad categories, doctrines and practices. And some religions, Islam and Judaism in particular, are religions whose doctrines make central the prescriptivity of laws. Law and the texts in which they are consolidated are explicit, codified, discursive, propositional phenomena. And as such, they emerge in the foreground of a doctrine, Islam as it might be, Judaism, only because of an enabling background of practices, non-discursive phenomena, collective experiences, dispositions and habits, and a range of institutions, as well as the social memories in which these abide. And so when the subject is how religious law travels to distant lands via the maritime passages that Kooria so instructively describes, lands where the ongoing practices and non-discursive phenomena are measurably different from the background of practices in which these laws initially emerged. When this happens, there's an enormous amount of negotiation and challenge which they encounter before they settle with some congruence in the zeitgeist of the local host cultures. And it is these dynamic engagements between the traveling religious cultures and the explicit laws and these host cultures that Kooria's work presents to us, culminating in distant recanonization of this particular madhab of Sunni law, as I said, amounting to what he calls a Shafi cosmopolis. So that's Memo. Now, I'm going to, just so that I don't have to come here and gasp all over again, I'm going to say a few words, just very few words about Amitav, and then I'll ask Memo to come and speak. Amitav Ghosh is known to all of you as one of the most widely read, admired. Amitav Ghosh is known to all of you as one of the most widely read and admired novelists of our time, a novelist who's almost unique in bringing to bear in his novels the deep knowledge he has acquired as an anthropologist and historian, indeed as a probing thinker about culture and history. The novels he has written that bear most directly on this evening's theme of the Indian Ocean archive is what has come to be called the Abyss Trilogy. The three novels, Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, Flood of Fire, in which he first depicts an erstwhile slave ship's journey carrying indentured laborers to Mauritius, and then turns to the journey to Canton, where the Chinese blockade the import of opium, and then continues the story all the way to the First Opium War. These traversals bring together in knowledgeably drawn connections the entire sea universe of the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean, which witnessed a wide range of these colonialist misadventures, which he presents with a kind of telling detail that only a literary sensibility can summon. So this evening, Mahmood will speak first. He'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and he will pose some questions for Amitav. And after Amitav responds and they engage with each other in a brief conversation, if there is time, we can move to a few questions from the floor.
So on behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai and the Infosys Science Foundation, I welcome all of you here this evening. It promises to be very exciting, and we have a really large crowd here. So welcome, and I hand over the proceedings. Fortunately, Professor Akeel Bilgrami has already given you an introduction, and now I request Dr. Mahmood Kooria to take over from there. Thank you.
Thank you, first and foremost, to Professor Bilgrami for giving such an elaborate commentary on my work, and I feel deeply honored to be awarded the Infosys Prize last year, and also to address such an erudite audience here at the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. I'm not familiar with the city much. I was just mentioning to Professor Bilgrami that I came here as a teenager running away from home during vacation. And after almost 20 years, I'm coming back to the city, or even if not more. But good to see at least some familiar faces here. When we were discussing the format of today's talk, we were thinking that I'll do 20 minutes and Amitav will do 20 minutes, but that Amitav insisted that I should speak longer and he will address some questions. And I was feeling guilty that most of you will be coming for him than me, and therefore I speaking for more than 20 minutes or even 10 minutes would be boring. But because he's not here, fortunately or unfortunately, he will have to bear with me until he arrives without the feeling of guilty or not guilty. I would try to speak at least for 25 minutes, and then we can follow the format that Professor Bilgrami just mentioned. So it's a great pleasure to be here and address all of you here, and thank you all so much for joining us today. And I personally am very grateful to the Infosys Science Foundation for organizing this along with HarperCollins India. And more importantly, to Amitav Ghosh, whose stories and words have inspired me personally and most of you across several years and continue to inform many generations and give life and hook to the dry academic way of approaching the past, I would say. I say hook because I use his works in my classes to get students interested in the medieval and modern Indian Ocean history, instead of reading another journal article, an academic book. And also to Professor Bilgrami, a year ago, reached out to me to discuss parts of my work. That's what he mentioned in his email. And I was super impressed that a person from philosophy, let alone an erudite and eminent scholar like him, would read my work and found it useful for a book that he said he is writing. And I must, if I may make a confession, when he sent me an email at that time saying so, that he had few questions on my book that he wanted to ask, especially building on an article, a very influential article that he published about 30 years ago called "What is a Muslim?" And I reread the essay in order to, with a couple of questions to him, thinking that, to continue or to make the conversation going. But then when I logged into the Zoom meeting with him, it wasn't just Professor Bilgrami. There was a whole bunch of Infosys team congratulating me for winning the Infosys Prize at that time. So I didn't get the chance to ask these questions to Professor Bilgrami, but also even more importantly, I look forward to seeing the book that he promised that he will elaborate on the essay that he published a few decades ago. For me personally, I'm deeply moved by the recognition of the jury of the Infosys Prize on the Indian Ocean, on the work of my work on the Indian Ocean history and Islam, maritime Islam. And they have been advancing it, including this session, into a larger audience through the sabbatical that they have introduced for scholars based outside the country, in order to spend at least 30 days in the country interacting with different audiences in the country. So today we will have a conversation on different methods of approaching and writing ocean and its past from academic and literary perspectives in the context of my work in the past 1 decade or so, in conversation with the works of Amitav Ghosh, who has been a torch bearer for many of us, guiding us towards the unknown oceans of the past, at least for 3 or 4 decades. For those who are not familiar with my work, briefly, Professor Bilgrami has already given a detailed commentary, and I again feel deeply humbled. But my main book, Islamic Law in Circulation, or the only single authored book that I have so far, addressed a very niche audience, addressing not just historians, but within history, legal historians, which is a very small field, believe me. And even within legal history, what I would say Islamic legal history or medieval Islamic legal history, which I would say number to only a couple of dozen people specialized in the field. So when I wrote the book, I addressed these specialists and a few graduate students who might be pursuing their PhD along these lines instead of addressing a larger audience. And the publisher, Cambridge University Press, being not so much concerned with the larger market of the book, they were happy to go ahead with it. Therefore, often get surprised when people outside medieval Islamic legal history tell me that they have read my work, especially the jury of the Infosys Prize, which consisting of people with so many other specializations, such as philosophy, political science, law, Buddhist studies, religious studies, area studies, and so forth. I don't want to repeat the whole book or other works that I have been doing, but I would like to emphasize 4 concerns central to the big book as well as overall scholarly pursuit that I have been doing. 2 are directly related to the title of today's session, Ocean as Archive. So directly related to the Indian Ocean world and its past, while 2 are not. I'll start with the ones which are not related to the ocean. The first one is this, that the history of law, so legal history. Much of the focus has been on European law alone. We might think that we are past this Eurocentric approaches in different disciplines, and Europe has been provincialized so convincingly. But even if you look at specialists of legal history in the law faculties of most or colleges of most European universities or the US, they all work predominantly on either Roman law as well as its early modern and modern recensions through various imperial, national, or provincial legal versions. And if you are lucky, you might have one or two specialists of canon law, which is again a reinvention of the Roman law in a different bottle. Histories of legal traditions in the rest of the world, especially of ancient and medieval periods, are yet to be taught systematically, whether it is of such immense global significance as Tang code or Buddhist code or Hindu law and so forth. I am not mentioning all that I wrote. So this has been one of my major concerns, to explore the larger legal cosmopolis, where multiple laws operated in a global stage, sometimes in conflict, at times in compromise, and at times replacing one another. Relatedly, and the second point is this: the majority of Muslims live outside the Middle East, especially in South and Southeast Asia, even more specifically in India and Indonesia, which constitute some of the two largest countries with largest number of Muslim population. But once it comes to the history of Islam's intellectual or legal traditions, much of the literature focuses on the Middle East alone, as if Muslims did not exist outside this central Islamic land. Muslims of South Asia or Southeast Asia appear in Islamic intellectual or legal historiography only after the colonial interventions in the 18th and 19th century, when, for example, the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company intervening into the realms of what is usually identified as the Anglo-Muhammadan law, or in the Indian context, or in the Dutch, the ontdekking van adatrecht, or the discovery of the customary law vis-a-vis so-called Islamic law. This negligence has dismissed the intellectual and philosophical agency of Muslims in these regions, especially in the ways in which they critically and creatively engaged with their own religion, reimagining it to their specific context, in contrast to their counterparts who conceived of Islam mostly in a Muslim majority context in the Middle East. So my work explores these dimensions with regard to Muslims of South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa, to South Africa, to explore their contributions as part of the larger intellectual and legal histories of their religion. And the third point, that all these regions that I mentioned, from South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa, South Africa, all of these are bound by the Indian Ocean. And once we take ocean as a methodological framework for historical inquiry, as many historians and scholars have already shown to us, and Professor Bilgrami has already mentioned Ken Chowdhury's work, but also earlier French and art schools' work, especially Fernand Braudel. So we see that when we take ocean as a method to approach the history, we saw that there are many similarities between these communities, from Cape Town to Georgetown in Malaysia, or Mombasa in Kenya to Maguindanao in the Philippines, Zanzibar in present-day Tanzania. Did I get it correct? Yeah, thank you. And Malabar, Zanzibar to Malabar in Kerala, or Malabar Hills here in Mumbai. How did this happen, and why and when? And particularly with regard to the Muslim communities from Cape Town to Georgetown, or Maguindanao to Maguindanao, all of them follow one particular school of Islamic law, Shafi'i school of law, which is very interesting, which is not what the majority of, the subcontinental Muslims follow, like in the mainlands of India or Bangladesh or Pakistan. So how did this happen? When did this happen? In places like Mumbai, Konkan coast, or Kerala coast and parts of Coromandel coast, why do they follow this Shafi'i school of law, not the Hanafi one, similar to the ones in Malaya, Singapore, up to East Asia? And fourth one, within the Indian Ocean region, Ken Chowdhury, his influential work has mentioned that law and trust were central to the working of trade in the Indian Ocean world. And success of a port or a region or even a country of that time depended on how much law and trust were maintained. So he didn't explain, or of course, that was not his concern, what sort of law people depended on. And my work, I would say, is one of the modest attempts looking at one law commonly used and practiced across these regions. But it all goes back to the larger cosmopolis of law that I mentioned. much work needed to be done in order to get a comprehensive sense of how the medieval societies operated in trans-regional settings, especially when you set off to a place that you didn't know, or the people that didn't look like you, or didn't speak like you, or whose customs and cultures totally were unfamiliar to, yet didn't restrain you from exploring and venturing into completely unknown lands across the oceans. So on all these fronts, one major emphasis that I have been keeping was on the emphasis of indigenous sources. And in historiography, we know, especially in the Indian Ocean historiography, that much of the history is written on the basis of the European sources or the European archives. So I would say this search for local sources emerged from a discomfort that many of us felt while studying at Leiden University in the Netherlands. For a group of students from there was a course for a group of students from different parts of Asia and Africa called Global Dutchman. It was basically an introduction to the global history, but through the Dutch eyes. These were great lectures, but in these lectures, the students, asked about the local sources or the local perceptions, while most of the historians, it was a series of lectures by different historians of global Dutch history, using Dutch East India Company record or Dutch West India Company record, VIC or WIC. And we often asked, how about the local sources and local perceptions? And often the answer we are too familiar with the answer that there are no local sources or no indigenous sources on these communities to interact with. And this can't be true, because a country like India, for example, which has such a long tradition of producing work on almost everything, but how come it didn't have any work on the arrival of Europeans in the context, in Indian subcontinent? We might think that there might be some grain of truth in it, because in India the common perception has been that, and again you would be very familiar with that, Indians hardly ventured outside to the sea. For example, Mahatma Gandhi in his autobiography talks about the resistance that he felt when he wanted to go abroad. So that notion of Kalapani and the corruption of the caste while going abroad, and the maritime trade, again the perception is that was often left to foreigners, such as Romans in the ancient times, Arabs and Persians and Chinese in the medieval times. All this can be challenged, but even so, I often wondered why there is hardly any records on European arrival in India, despite having so much materials in many European languages, whether it is Portuguese, French, Dutch, and of course English. And more importantly, Indian authors during these periods have produced some of the most prolific works in all sort of different forms and disciplines. Isn't it incredible that a whole industry of historical scholarship on the European discovery of India, or discovery of Asia, or age of discovery, has been produced for generations on the early modern period, that is from the 16th to 18th century, on the arrival of Portuguese or then Dutch in India, without any reference to Indian sources. Some people refer to an Arabic text called Tuhfatul Mujahideen, written in Malabar in 16th century, as the only local source available from the region. And this narrative has remained almost unchallenged for almost 200 years, since this Arabic text translations into English in 1832 or 33. Latest research has uncovered at least 4 more similar works in Arabic from Malabar. But how about sources in other Indian languages? Historians are largely silent, except a recent attempt by Sebastian Prange, who came up with an English translation of a Malayalam text, although he didn't locate the Malayalam original, which turns out to be a translation, an 18th century translation of a 16th century Arabic text, which in itself is very interesting. Does that mean there was no works in Indian languages at all? Which is not true, I would say. Consider, for example, I'll give one brief example. Consider this one passage from the Sanskrit poet Melpattur Narayana Bhattadiri. While he was visiting Cochin in the early decades of the 16th century, he was amazed to see some white Europeans roaming around the city. He poetized his amuse by saying a long poem, but the last 2 lines I will read. Kanjukanda kinjidevekshaniya vipandura vadana bimbeha parasiga logai sanjarishnu damarge. Along with many other descriptions about their weapons and dresses, as you can spot in the first part of the passage, he concludes by saying that because these Parasigans or the Portuguese who are noticeable with their white faces traveling through the areas. Some roads are blocked. And he, like in 21st century, considered because of some VIPs are passing by through the otherwise already congested road. So Narayana Bhattacharya's remark is possibly not only the earliest notice of Portuguese in Sanskrit, but in any Indian language. And the text is called Goshri. Goshri is for Kochi. Goshri is the description of the city. Is not only his work, and the Portuguese are not only the community he encountered in Cochin. He goes on to describe many other communities. Melpattur Narayana Bhattacharya is best known in Kerala, at least for his Narayaniyam, a finest Sanskrit work of religious relics in praise of Narayana, focusing on the themes of Bhagavad Purana, along with the summarized version of Ramayana. And even today, devotees continue to recite the text in the evenings. So Bhattacharya's remarks on the Portuguese, these were part of a reflections of a larger world of the exchanges. And he is not alone. In Malayalam, Poondayanam Nambudiri, who is very famous work, Jnanapana, is not amazed. Rather, he was sort of disgusted with the whole pursuit of material world, profit and, from his mystical orientation. So he says, Sornangal Navaratnangala Kundum Ennang Kudade Vilkunudu Chiler Atrayumalla Kappal Vepichitu Metra Nedunidartham Shiva Shiva. Some people are trading in gold and gems infinitely. A few others are trading even in elephants and finest horses. Yet another group is profiting from building ships. Shiva Shiva. What to earn from so much wealth. So within just 20 miles away from these two authors, Sanskrit and Malayalam authors of Guruvayur, from Guruvayur or Trikandiyur, the epicenter of Kerala mathematics, which was once identified as such, the older text, Tuhfatul Mujahideen, were written. The point is basically this: there are definitely indigenous sources, and despite the repetition that there is hardly any, I would say that this absence of sources is tied up with the older colonial complaint that Indians didn't have not only sources but even the discipline of writing history itself. Many historians have demonstrated in the past few decades how and why this is not true. The illustrious Textures of Time by David Shulman, Velcheri Narayana Rao, and Sanjay Subramaniam, for example, being one of the best example of making case against this notion on the basis of the Karanam literature from Andhra, Telugu, Kannada, and Tamil regions. Discipline of history existed. There are also an enormous amount of indigenous sources also existed. The question is how to use them and why to use them, especially with regard to the oceanic world that many Indians ventured into. So indeed, there won't be many detailed references as you must have just seen, or you just saw from Narayana Bhattacharya's Goshri Nagara Varnaram, very cursory reference. Often you have only cursory references on local people and actors. But it is our task to utilize the cursory references instead of relying solely on European sources. For example, I think of Amitav in an Andic land, where he discusses this one word, bomb, BM. Oh. Whenever I gave that section to my students in the Indian Ocean history, of course, the story itself is very interesting, how Amitav goes to, at length to uncover these small 3 letters or 2 letters in order to. So I encourage students to think about the methodology more than the story. How to read primary sources when the information is so fragmentary. So I'm sure you are familiar with the Anandic clan and the discovery, so I'm not repeating. But how to read primary sources when the information is so fragmentary, almost to the level that it doesn't make sense. But through ethnography, anthropology, text mining, philology, epigraphy, some of which are old fields, but inform us and should inform a historian to do their work instead of complaining the so-called absence of indigenous sources. And this is not just about a Bomma that Ghosh has uncovered from the Cairo Geniza documents, but also many other similar figures and communities who ventured into the sea. It is not the foreigners such as the Romans, Arabs, Persians, or Chinese who carried out trade with India on the seashores, but also from the old Buddhist monks to Hindu priests. I often think of, who manned many Hindu temples in Southeast Asia, as well as Aryans, Dravidians, Baniyas, Brahmins, Bengalis, Bohras, Chettis, Cholas, Chulias, Gujaratis, Kalingas, Kashmiris, Konkanis, Mappilas, Marakkayas, Navayats, Odiyas, Punjabis, Sindhis, and so forth, Tamils, of course. The communities that historically ventured across the ocean are enormous, despite the common perception that Indians hardly ventured into the sea. Even so, a collective amnesia grounds the narrative and makes us believe that, Indians didn't go on to the sea. So I'll end with a brief or two quick stories. One is this from a 10th century story from a sailor narrated to Captain Buzurg. So he says that in the vicinity of bustling port of Mansoura, somewhere in Gujarat, he witnessed many people from lower Kashmir arriving at the port through the river Mihran on boats made out of bags of grains. It might sound stupid or stupendous, but the sailor explains. Kashmir was a distant land from Mansoura, which is, Kashmir is reachable only after a journey of 70 days by land. However, travel by the river was much easier. The river Mihran mirrored the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates during the periods of floods, and its overflowing waters connected Kashmir and its people directly to the sea. Flood was a time of calamity for most people, but also a time of opportunity and innovativeness for some others, connecting the hinterland Kashmiris with the ocean. The Kashmiris traveled in and along with the river upon the bags of grain, each weighing between 700 to 800 pounds. The grains were encased in skins treated with resin, which made them waterproof. By tying these bags together very skillfully, they created a sturdy boat to navigate the Mihran, which could be, the river. And Mansoura, according to the story, it could be either Brahmanabad or situated adjacent to it. So Buzurg bin Shahryar, hailing from Ram Hurmuz in Persia, compiled stories chronicling the wonders of India, titled Ajaib-ul-Hind. More than the subcontinent now we identify with India, such nations as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, he was telling the marvels of the Indian Ocean. This is unique and curious at the same time. Did Kashmiris really trade on the seashore, that too in the time of flood? Or is it one of those exaggerated, miraculous stories that the foreigners talked about and exoticized Indian subcontinent? All these questions are very important, especially as he tells this story along with many other miraculous stories, many of which are quite possible and wonderful only to his ears and senses, but not necessarily so for others, such as the descriptions of burning of the dead bodies, or self-immolation, or the suicidal warriors, all of which we are familiar with. But many other stories are also so incredible or quote-unquote wonderful that one struggled to make sense of this, such as the story of a giant lobster, almost the size of an island, or a giant bird saving the shipwrecked sailors, and whale islands and so forth. So if these are all told by sailors and collected in a Persian account, consider 1 century later, the Kada Sarid Sagara, that you are, again, many of you would, or all of us might have grown up reading. Out of its 18 Lambagas or books, consider the 11th one, the most iconic work of stories in the region, and the title itself, of course, the Kada Sarid Sagara is ocean of the streams of stories, retold in Sanskrit by the Shaivite Somadeva from Kashmir, again from Kashmir in the 11th century. So I am not repeating the whole story, but after you go back home, try to read that whole passage. But what is in that story is that there is a whole lot of avid, and I would even say accurate description of the medieval Indian ocean trade, where the central hero, Naravahana Datta, goes to the coastal city of Vaishaga, could be identified with Vishaga or Vaisaga or its premises, partakes in horse race, and again in the Coromandel, because we are very familiar with the horse trade, which was known at least in 12th and 13th century, along with elephants. And a merchant comes from there and addresses the Vidyadhara king with many associations, including with places like in Lamba, Bali, and so forth, and Malaya as well. All these names can be read differently, but that is precisely the point in a story related to the ocean. So, can we take this story and similar stories at their face value? What do stories tell to historians? it's easy to dismiss them as fanciful imaginations and baseless claims and so forth, which many generations of scholars have done. But how to use such sources as potential sources of history and how to read them critically and creatively. In a lecture that Professor Romila Thapar gave in the very city almost 5 decades ago in 1979, she mentioned, the lecture later on published as Historian and the Epic, one of the most insightful essays. She says that more than the historicity of the epic, something like Ramayana and Mahabharata, it is the historical consciousness that is what mattered to the most people. Indeed, this historical consciousness is very important. So, but especially in a text like Kada Sarit Sagara, when the author in Kashmir writing about Malaya or Bali or the Vaishaka, especially when he claims that it is taken, and also especially when it is taken from an older text, Gunadhya's Brahat Kada, the great narrative or great story, along with similar resistance in the Brahat Kada Manjari by also another 11th century Kashmiri author, Kshemendra. So, how about the stories that are not epics, but rather circulated among sailors in the present, like the books that published recently, and then continue to circulate among us? So, with grains of present and explanations to what might sound stupid or stupendous. So, the Shulman, Rao Subramaniam trio have already shown us that the readers themselves could make a distinction between what is real, fictional, logical and illogical while you read certain stories. But the problem with that is that such reading strategies or performance strategies with regard to historical text might sound appealing. However, Dawood Ali has once pointed out that we lack any supporting evidence to substantiate that most people in fact made these distinctions. So then the question is, what do we do with the stories when certain dimensions are conceivable and certain dimensions are incomprehensible for our modernist, materialist, mechanical, tampered minds, where a certain kind of logic sets in when we read these stories. So who is there better than Amitav Ghosh, the great storyteller of the subcontinent, to talk about this distinction? So not just a novelist or a storyteller, but also a trained academic who has once, I would say, was corrupted by the specific kind of thought process that I just mentioned. But also went beyond that corrupted logic and went beyond also academia to the world of storytelling, using some of the most foundational techniques and methods. And the timing is also so perfect that because he published this, work Ghost Eye, where the central plot crosses the limits of logic and reality that we are familiar with. I emphasize that part, the logic and the reality that we are familiar with. And much of this is relatable to the history and story, much of the book. But the central themes of reincarnation, transmigration, miracles, now identified in the Gen Z terms as eruption, etc., are beyond the usual narratives or logical narratives that we are trained with. So the social scientist or historian in me immediately jumps in to say this novel is promoting some sort of, sorry to use this word, I'm looking for a better vocabulary, superstition. But the question is not only about these particular themes of, let's say, transmigration or reincarnation. How does a person, not just social scientists or academics who may not subscribe to the belief systems of any religion or any region and any unrelated ideas, myths and mythologies, when they appear in historical texts or in contemporary texts, also how to make sense of them instead of dismissing them as illogical, fanciful, etc. And in the novel, Ghosh already expressed his grudge against the philosophers, setting aside Plato's Republic's disquisition on what is known in the Western world as metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls between species, and treating it as allegory or metaphor. So, of course, all of this comes from the materialist and mechanical understanding of the world. But still, how to make sense of things that, often similar to the, some of the fanciful stories that I mentioned, how to make sense of them. And this perspective is very important in a way, I would say, like especially when you take ocean as a approach to history or the past. And again, Amitav Ghosh has been at the forefront of what I would say the cultural take on the ocean. In the 1980s, when, for example, many historians were publishing on the Indian Ocean as a framework to approach history, especially Ken Chowdhury and many others, they were very much fascinated with the idea of economic history, trade, and so forth. Whereas Amitav published this book, many books, I'm not naming one, but many books were the social and cultural worlds of the circulations and exchanges across the oceanic world was already projected or were at the center of his storytelling. So almost 13 years ago, when I did an interview with him during his visit in 2012 in Amsterdam, you mentioned that Indian Ocean informed your work probably started when you were working in Kerala, but that is just one point. And also what I remember in that conversation that, in comparison with the historians and historical approaches or academic approaches to history, for a storyteller or a novelist like you are interested that history is like a river and the historian is writing about the ways the river flows and the currents and cross currents in the river. But within this river, there are also fish, and the fish can swim. And it is very interesting that almost 15 years later, that we get to read the fish perspective completely in Ghosh eye or ghost eye. So one concluding question that I will have, or the second question that I will have, as a person who started or walked ahead of the time, when historians are catching up, doing the social history, cultural history of the oceanic exchanges, vis-a-vis the economic or the mercantile histories, what is the future that you are seeing? Not only we historians are limited by sources and therefore we can only talk about the past, though with some relatability, mostly scholarly with the present. Whereas you are relating it with the present and therefore also influencing and changing with your own perceptions, especially the environmental crises and many other dimensions which have been at the core of your latest works. So from the oceanic historical perspective or past perspective, what is the future that you see for the field of this study, but also as well as the future of the humanity, beyond sheer optimism or pessimism? And your work present a completely unexpected take on the interventionism into these problems. So I'll conclude with one last message to all of you, that it is also about looking at the sea and taking the sea, the perspective, especially for a crowd living in Mumbai. It is that you walk right by every day, somebody or something that you look at on a daily basis, but never really see, the kind of longue durée perspectives for the ocean and the ways in which it shaped the past, but also continue to shape the present. And it is also going beyond the age-old beliefs that Indians hardly ventured outside the sea. With it, I conclude once again.
I was elected a fellow last year, and it was a wonderful moment. And it's really wonderful to be back here speaking to you. And it's wonderful particularly to be here with my old friend Akeel Bilgrami, from whose work I've learned so much, and Mahmood. I met Mahmood, as he says, it was 14 or 12 years ago. Yeah, 13 years ago in Amsterdam. And in the course of our conversation, I became completely persuaded that we shared so many important ideas, interests. But what really strikes me and struck me then about Mahmood's work, two very important things. One is the search for the legal system of the Indian Ocean. Because really what the West has tried to impose on us is this idea that Grotius invents the law of the sea and in some sense invents the law, international law as such. And yet what we know that Grotius was actually doing was creating this kind of screen for the incredible crimes of the Dutch East India Company. For example, the absolute extermination of the Bandanese people simply because they wanted to get their hands on the nutmeg tree. It's an astonishing thing, And, what is law? After all, law is also usage, And one of the very interesting things about the nutmeg tree and the Bandanese, so the nutmeg tree was endemic to the Banda Islands, And the nutmeg tree produces both nutmeg and mace.
both of which were incredibly valuable spices in the Middle Ages and so on. So, people from all around the Indian Ocean used to go to the Banda Islands, to collect nutmegs. Many of them lived there for a long time. There were Arabs, there were Chinese, there were people from India, from Iran, from Africa. Many of them spent years and years living in the Banda Islands. Why did it never occur to any of them to just pick up some nutmeg saplings and take them back to China or India or wherever and plant them? It's really a very interesting question, don't you think? I mean, because why didn't they do that? Why did the Europeans think of that but nobody else? And the answer is very simple. In our cultural world, and actually even globally, in a global cultural world, a product is not authentic until it comes from a certain terrain, So just like Bordeaux can only be produced in Bordeaux. I mean, you can't go to the Western Ghats and plant the same thing and call it Bordeaux, And certain cheeses can only come from certain parts of Europe. A nutmeg was not a nutmeg unless it came from the Banda Islands. And the nutmeg was regarded as having incredible medicinal power. So people would have thought that, this nutmeg is a diminished nutmeg. It won't cure me of certain diseases unless it comes from the Banda Islands. Really, I remember from my childhood, certain things only came from certain places. Like in Bengal, for example, there's a sweetmeat called the moa, but you only get it from Joynagar. I don't even know where Joynagar is, but it's a word that we say Joynagar and moa. I'm sure you have innumerable examples here across the West Coast. But today, worldwide, those kinds of links between the terrain and the product exist only in Europe, because everywhere else they were erased. So, it would never have occurred to a Dutchman to say, "Oh, there in Bordeaux they have all this wine. Let's go and kill all the people in Bordeaux and grab their wine." It wouldn't have occurred to them. It was only because of this kind of racial, if you like, this racial difference. It becomes the law of the racial exception, which actually becomes formalized by Grotius. Where he says that if those are barbarous peoples, you can take anything you want from them. So I think it's very, very important for us to do what Mahmood is trying to do, to reconstitute the usages of the Indian Ocean. Because we know that actually free trade has only ever existed in the pre-modern Indian Ocean. Every sultanate, every kingdom, every Raja's territory, people would compete. The Rajas would compete with each other to attract the merchants, because the merchants could just get up and go away, to some other place. Yeah. So I think this is a very important part of your work, Mahmood. The other really important aspect of your work is trying to reconstitute earlier sources. And you're lucky there that, you're from Kerala, because as you know, this Hungarian scholar has been doing incredible work on the Syriac archives. And the Syriac archives go back a very long way, because Syrian Christian priests have been traveling, to Damascus and so on for millennia, really. And many of those Syrian Christian churches have incredible archives. So that's one set of archives that I think you really should look at. But also, of late, we've seen the emergence of many other archives. Bishara's work, I'm sure you know it, called Ocean of Debt. He's a Kuwaiti, incredibly brilliant historian. His grandfather was a nakhoda, that is the captain of a boat. And from the Nakhoda's writings, he reconstituted an incredibly interesting history of, what sailors did, where they went. His earlier book, actually, The Ocean of Debt, is about Gujarati merchants who are spread out across, the sheikdoms and small sultanates along the Gulf, and most of all along the coast of Africa. And, it's such an extraordinary sort of irony that in fact, these kings, who were mainly Muslims, entrusted their entire fortunes to Gujarati Hindus. And the Gujarati Hindus basically managed these people's khazanas and so on, And so much of the seed money of, Gujarati prosperity actually came from the Middle East and continues to come from the Middle East, we know the story of Dhirubhai Ambani in Aden, for example. And that story repeats itself, all over. So I think you will find an incredible amount of material, certainly in Arabic. If you look at other Nakoda's diaries and so on, that's a very important source. The other sources that really need to be examined and which are completely neglected are the writings of the greatest seafaring people of the Indian Ocean, who were the Bugis, of Sulawesi. The longest epics in the world, in fact, written in Bugis, the Bugis epics. And I don't think they've been properly studied from that point of view. And I say this because actually I myself have been for a long time now reading and studying really the Bengali Mongol Kabbo, we say, Mongol Kavyas. And especially, I'm very interested in the Kavya of Monasha Devi, the goddess of snakes. And what happens in this story is that, in fact, a merchant, Chand Sadagar, he's called, Sadagar, like merchant, he incurs the wrath of Monasha Devi because he won't curb his hunger for profit and he won't worship her. And she represents really, the creatures of the earth. We call her the goddess of snakes, but she's also the goddess of storms and, tidal bores and so on. She chases him away from Bengal. And in that story, there's a long list of places that he goes to, and I don't think they've been properly studied and correlated yet. And again, there are references to the Portuguese, quite detailed references, in fact, in the Mongol Kabbo literature. But as you said again, and this is a very interesting part of what you said, often in our records of the past, there is this element of what modern materialist historians like to think of as fantasy. So for example, in Arabic, especially at the popular level, there are all these stories of karamat, which are miracles, the miracles of the saints, of the Sufi saints and so on. And actually, also one of the wonderful things of coming to Bombay is that you see immediately you're in that Indian Ocean world. There's such a close resemblance with, say, Zanzibar. You can just see it's just across the ocean at the Sufi shrines. You see that in the temples. So these miracle tales, you might call them, they pose a real challenge to the historian because the historian can only read them in one way. Of late, there's been some very, very interesting work. I don't know, have you ever read the work of the historian Carlos Eire? He teaches at Yale. He has a wonderful book called They Flew, and it's about levitation amongst Catholic saints. In the 16th, 17th century, 15th, 16th, 17th, the innumerable Catholic saints who levitated. St. Joseph of Cupertino, Teresa of Avila, and, the records he produces, so many records. These levitating saints were witnessed by kings, by, a philosopher like Leibniz, by Leibniz's patron as well. Literally by thousands and thousands of people saw these saints levitate, and they didn't want to levitate. They hated levitating. They actually had to be held down, and often were. If you haven't read this book, you really must. It's like 800 pages, but because it's very, very heavily documented. But at the end of it, unless you're just a sort of die-hard materialist who doesn't believe anything in the world, you have to accept that something was happening. Something that you cannot explain modern methods of reasoning, if you can't accept that, then what? You're just going to say, yeah, all our ancestors were deluded idiots. What makes us think we're cleverer than our ancestors? We're not. That is perfectly clear, really, nowadays. So, you should really read this, because at the end of Carlos Eire's book, I really thought to myself, someone has to do this for the Indian Ocean world. Can you imagine the wealth of the material? Not just in India, but most of all in Indonesia, I would say, where those living traditions still exist.
Yeah.
So anyway, all in all, I want to say that I'm really delighted that Mahmood has received this Infosys Prize. And I was so happy when I heard about it. I wrote to Akeel, in fact, and that was why I really wanted to be here to support your work and to really celebrate your work. So thank you.
So my question to Mom is, how do you actually balance the archives? Because you see the bias. I see that in international health, particularly. For example, WHO materials will say that Indonesians are superstitious, or for that matter, you see local sources speaking about Indonesian family, for example, family. That is, or they will speak about issues, political issues related to vaccination, why people don't get vaccinated. Or they would talk about well-being, the whole issue of well-being. So how do you exactly balance these sources in your own work? In other words, how do you read along the archival grain, so as to say?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Neelakandan, for the question. And it is always a constant negotiation with your sources from multiple dimensions, how to make sense of the text that in front of you. And it's also ways of interpreting it and giving multiple, again, Netherlands Eamon Davis is one of the finest examples of, to engage with the, she has this fascinating work called Fiction in the Archive. It's not about giving one answer and one way in reading the sources, rather, going with multiple explanations and multiple interpretations possible with the sources. And often what I see is that there are these circles of contradictions with regard to the sources. So sometimes you have very elaborate multiple perspectives on the sources. At times you have very fragmentary sources. And it is always a challenge and also a task to negotiate between the availability or absence of sources. Yeah.
I'm a judge of the Supreme Court. Now, Mr. Ghosh talked of books on levitation. Right? Now, whether they were flights of fancy or whether actually social circumstances is a matter to be determined. Take any of them. For example, you talked of Narayan Bhattathiri. Narayana Bhattathiri's Narayaniam picks up from Bhagavata and gives us beautiful descriptions of what was happening. Now, half of this are you going to dismiss as flights of fancy? Take Ramayana, the Pushpaka Vimana, what happened in Sri Lanka, any of the Puranas. So all of them give these graphic descriptions of which we in our modern avatar think that it's flights of fancy, superstition, and just dismiss it offhand. So how do you really gauge how much of it is superstition, how much of it is poetic fancy, how much of it indicates a social norm?
I'm not a historian. I don't have to balance these things. I write fiction, I tell stories. So I can write about these things. I can, I can explore them in different ways, which in fact, I would say that it's a fiction writer's job, to explore these things from a different way. I think one would be legitimately suspicious of most historians who would take that path. But Carlos Eire is a very distinguished historian, He's at Yale, he's a senior professor. And his book, he does incredible documentation. So you have to find the documentation and see if it can be relied on and proceed in that way. Yes. But that's your job as a judge. But, A.K. Ramanujan, the poet, he has a wonderful story about his father, His father was a astrologer, a mathematician, and also a very distinguished, official. And he always says that, he says over there that his father could seamlessly go from doing astrology and praying and so on to doing extremely empirical work. And, as you must know here, if you go to TIFR in early in the morning, you'll see all these brilliant mathematicians sitting outside, in their angavastrams and so on, with all the marks on their forehead. So this, I think, what the point that Ramanujan was making is that it's context specific, and that as Indians, within our culture, it's very possible to have context specific beliefs.
I find something very puzzling about our attitude towards the sea. In many Gujarati sources, Zanzibar is mentioned as the suburb of Harar. And yet, in the same 19th century, say, Karsandas Mulji goes to England and is excommunicated or has to for crossing the seas, and so many punish for doing that. How does it doesn't seem to make sense, attitude. And then yet the merchants are earning so much in Zanzibar, trade is so...
In the 16th century, Duarte Barbosa goes to Malacca, and he reports 4,000 Gujarati merchants living, and not just Gujaratis. Often they found ways of rationalizing these things. For example, to go from Bengal to Puri, for the pilgrimage, they would go by sea. So later, when they started traveling to, when the indentured workers started going to, Mauritius, etc., they just said, we are going to Puri.
I'll just add to that. I think it is true that excommunication was a social reality in many contexts, but that didn't restrict people from traveling, especially you are anyway going away. So it doesn't matter whether you are excommunicated or you're part of the community. But also you're coming back with such a huge capital, either social capital, cultural capital, or financial capital that compromises the excommunication. Think of Gandhi again, the way he excommunicated, and then when he came back, that excommunication doesn't matter for most of the traders who, Gujarat is similar to Malacca in Mozambique in 16th century, 17th century. So many Gujaratis and even Brahmins, Brahmin merchants, not only going for trade, but also marrying widows and so forth. So these evidences we have. So in theory, these things were there, and also in practice, the consequences of it. But that didn't restrict people from venturing out.
I understand Kalapani for the hinterland of North India. But when you look at literature from Mauritius in French, the Caribbean, they're still talking about Kalapani when they talk about a gentleman who leaves from Madurai. It doesn't make sense to me. And maybe as a scholar and a specialist, you could tell me, what is this Kalapani for the man traveling from Madurai, from Pondicherry? Or is this a colonial construct? Ensure that the coolie doesn't come back home to tell him, you cross the Kalapani, off with you.
Colonialism certainly hardened many of these boundaries because it created incredible caste anxiety. What you could do, what you could not do, But it is also a fact, I think, that it restricted people in certain ways. Usages restricted people in certain ways. What's very interesting in this regard is the Indian merchants who went to Guangzhou, in the 18th and 19th centuries for the opium trade. So mainly the Indian merchants who went were like white adjacent, like Parsis and Armenians and so on. We know how enterprising Sindhis are, but they didn't go until the late 19th century. And I think one of the reasons for this is that the merchant communities, all the foreign merchants lived in a very segregated community, it was completely cut off from China. So it was called the foreign enclave. And there you had to find refuge in one of the hongs, the merchant houses. And these belonged to the Dutch and the English and so on. The Parsis were lucky because of the Surat connection. They went from, in the early years, they lived in the Dutch hong, But the atmosphere of these hongs was such that there was a huge emphasis on feasting. So, a lot of beef, a lot of pork. So I think those created certain inhibitions that they didn't want to go to. Whereas we know also from so many of the sources, Al-Idrisi and so on, that when Bania merchants went to the Gulf, they were completely free to be vegetarian. So that was one thing that made it possible for them to live over there. In fact, there are all these stories about how they would capture seagulls, and the Banias would buy the seagulls from them and set them free and so on. Beautiful stories. That kind of pluralism was not possible, within the culture of the, colonial-dominated establishments.
If you look at, there are passages, but then I understand it not as an excommunication, but rather as a process of quarantine. You don't have rights to do certain rituals immediately after you arrive from the sea, which is very rationable.
Right.
Yeah, you do the prayashchitas, then you can get back to the community. So Kalapani as a word, I don't know when it appears in the sources, but the notion related to the caste pollution is there from the Smritis and Vedas onward. Yet, people continue to follow. And then even not only people, even goats. So similar to what Amitav mentioned, even goats were carried carried away from India, the Tamil merchants carrying goats, Shaiva goat, to Guangzhou in 13th century. Similarly, we have a 14th century Maqamat Hariri illustration of Indian African merchants carrying probably an Indian deity across the Arabian Sea. So on both ways, across the Bay of Bengal as well as on the Arabian Sea, goats are being carried. The notions were there, but people also found very creative ways. And also, to what extent or how many people did actually read Smritis and Vedas? And even if they did read, how many people actually followed those? Especially when you are in the, you have to make a livelihood for yourself, then, the scriptures come on a one level, but not necessarily on a everyday life.
Recently, I reported on a story on birds that travel from the southern Antarctic Ocean. They come all the way to the Indian Ocean, pelagic birds. And one of the things that a scientist said that some of the best observations are made by sailors and by people in the Navy. And now, listening to your talk, it strikes me that are there records from the Indian subcontinent going back maybe centuries ago about biodiversity that exists in the Indian Ocean? I'm just curious to know if there are sources that I can read about. Thank you. And if you know of some stories like that. Thank you.
Again, we might associate it as fanciful, but it's a matter of rereading the sources, that have long been dismissed as useless. Rather, the ways in which how can we read. And I was reading, for example, this Tamil text, Chilappadigaram, and then also Manimaigalai. If you read this text and the descriptions of the islands and the different, flora and fauna in each island, and especially the concept of the Tamil Sangam concept of Thinai, in which, each different environmental zone is distinguished on the basis of the plants and flowers and birds and so forth that live and grow. So these sources, it's a matter of rereading them. Often when we think of biology or zoology and all these things, we immediately associate with the works produced from 16th and 17th century onward in European sources or languages. But, it's a matter of rereading our own sources or Indian sources in a different or new perspectives. And therefore, I don't have an immediate answer on a particular kind of bird. But even the very term diaspora, comes from biology, which is very much used in the Indian Ocean context in order to identify the trade diasporas. Philip D. Curtin in 1984 published this book. But that comes from, this whole observation of birds and how their migrations across different lands.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Ikra and I am a master's student at Mumbai University. I'm working on Konkani Muslim histories. So I just wanted to highlight or even ask one kind of question. When we talk of composite cultures in India, we are given the word Ganga, Jamuna, Tehzeeb. However, when I kind of studied Konkan, Islam, etc., I wanted to know how can we use hybridity as a concept to reconstitute the or reconstruct the identities which are produced along the Indian Ocean. So, any of the speakers, if you can
Quickly, I would say, it's your choice and you're free to use, text concept like hybridity. And I have used it, but then people have disagreements on that particular term, and then they come with, for example, older terms like composite culture or cosmopolitanism and so forth. All of these words, conceptual categories are always problematic. They have their own advantages and disadvantages. So you are free to choose and make a decision for yourself on why you use a term like hybrid, but then not others.
I think we should ask Akeel about hybridity since his friend put a gloss on the term.
No, I'm not going to speak about hybridity, but I have a question, Amitav, for both of you. But since you mentioned a mix of colonialism and race and economic issues, the East India Company and Grotius, Grotius consolidated the possibilities for East India Company by arguing for the first time what we are now living with overall, which is that not just individual human beings, but corporations have rights, right? So it empowered the Dutch East India Company is what he had mostly in mind, but of course it was immediately embraced by the British and the French. So the idea of corporate rights was first founded by just theoretically. The question that I had, you've written fascinatingly in the first of your trilogy about the travel of indentured labor and the stories there. So a question that I have, which many of you might have an opinion on too, is when European populations migrated to other parts of the temperate world, the north of the Americas, the Antipodes, Australia, New Zealand, the southern corners of Africa, with their own populations in settler colonialism, they diffused capital to these parts. These became a capitalist, in a more perverse way. They were very vibrant forms of economy that pretty much diffused to these parts of the world. Why didn't they diffuse capital to those parts of the world where they only sent a governing class and not their own populations to settle? Why? After all, they would have had cheap labor in the millions, and they do that now. Why didn't they do it then? And I can't think of how you can leave racism out in the explanation. So it's never purely economic. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I mean, really, they always talk about the Dutch East India Company as the pioneer of capitalism, the first joint stock corporation and so on. But look what it does in the Banda Islands. They kill off all the native people. Let's say they do that. The capitalist path after that is to open the islands to the highest bidder. But that's not what they do. They divide the island up into plantations. Then they invite in Dutch-descended white planters. They give them the plantations, and they also give them an undertaking that they will provide them with slaves twice a year, which they continued to do until the late 19th century. So how is this not racial capitalism? That's exactly what it is.
Resistance to sort of stories, etc., which don't seem to fall within the very rational frame. Is perhaps one way of thinking about it is that there is also so little of a history of the emotion in the sense of the modernity, and we don't enter a lot of our understanding about modernity through the crisis of emotion. And that is something that is in the media for instance, the last 15 years, etc. You can see that has been very well used to the detriment of a lot of us. So any response if you have about resistance to these fables being because we've not really acknowledged the depth of our understanding, emotionally speaking.
The whole idea, and especially from an Indian Ocean history perspective, the history of emotions is a terrain that completely neglected. Again, as I was mentioning, for generations, historians have been interested in economic historic questions, on the nitty-gritties of trade, how much, pepper or spices were carrying off. But the social and cultural implications of the travel and the exchanges across these places, that is not explored much. And therefore, and only recently people, in the last 10, 15 years or so, people have started digging that. And emotions is one realm that yet to be explored in the details.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I remember, when I first wrote in an antique land, I shared the manuscript with Sanjay Subramaniam, who was my colleague at the Delhi School of Economics. And he read it and he came back to me and he said, if I were you, I would throw this in the dustbin. I don't know what you're trying to do. Is it some psychological thing? Because he said, where's the economic history? Where's the trade? So, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a very strong emphasis upon those things. I think that's fading now, though. And increasingly, there are micro-histories that focus on, these other aspects. One person I'll particularly cite here is Niall Green, who's written about soldiers from Hyderabad, and their traditions of soldiering. And I think there's a very rich field to be seen there, because Indian soldiers were not like Western soldiers. We know they were not. They always had to have some kind of mystic in the battalion. They insisted on that to the degree to which the British had to give in and give them, either he would be some Sufi sheikh or most often a naked Swamiji, which they thoroughly disapproved of. But we know that their experience of soldiering was really very, very different from that of Westerners.
This reminds me that apparently, and this is the materialist version of it, apparently British soldiers in Iraq this time refused to serve unless they were served chicken tikka masala.
Professor Kooria, on the language of the sources that you look into, so usually it is considered, Arabic is considered as the sort of vehicle through which Islamic legal works are written throughout the Indian Ocean region. But I was really wondering, do you see vernacular sources as well, in a way that vernacular texts are also, or vernacular scripts are also being used to write Islamic legal texts? Or do we see a kind of interaction between vernacular languages in the sense that, so I am not an expert, but I do know a little bit about the existence Arabic Malayalam. So do we see that as any sort of connection with these kinds of movement or these texts? Also to Mr. Ghosh, I was wondering, so there's this similar Islamic Bangla that we call it in Bengal, or Dohashi. So do you see like a possibility of studying it rather than maybe in sense of those connections, but maybe in the Bay of Bengal arena rather than in maybe like existing what PhD sees this as a religious kind of an angle? So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So the sources and the languages, again, Amitav's work have inspired me along these lines, especially using multiple sources in different languages. Again, you used Arabic and also other sources, especially Cairo Geniza, which is Judeo-Arabic. Similarly, so Judeo-Arabic is this practice of writing Arabic in Hebrew script. So the Arabic Malayalam that you said is the counterpart. Malayalam written in Arabic script. And you mentioned the Iswan Pirj's work on the Syriac. Similarly, there is also this practice of Malayalam written in Syriac script. Yeah. So this is something that I'm very much interested in, and in the Indian Ocean context, if you have to study any port town, a medieval port town or early modern port town, early modern, when I say early modern, it's 1500 to 1800 roughly, you have sources in at least 15 languages. Yeah. So often what you do is that historians have been doing is that they go to Dutch East India Company archives or English East India Company archives and just work on that. You take Mumbai, or Mumbai is a big city, but a small city like Cochin or Calicut, you have 15 languages in which you have sources available. So Syriac, Arabic, Turkish, Ottomans being, having their own age of exploration across the Indian Ocean. And then all the European languages, Portuguese, French, and so forth. And also other Asian languages, Chinese, something that Indian historians have rarely used in the context of Indian sources, Indian context. And Malay, Malay sources, big, and Swahili sources, and so forth. So I don't want to list, but then this is something that I aspire to do. Of course, it's impossible to do all these languages, but something that I have been trying to do, especially for a theme or for a particular person or region or a story. If there are sources available in more than one languages, I try to explore them as much as I can, especially in original language.
Yeah, it's really such a sad and unfortunate thing that so much of Indian history has been written by scholars who didn't know a single Indian language. Like Chris Bailey. He's written book after book, but always using, some sort of translator or something. But this is it's really terrible actually, because after all, the language also conveys an atmosphere, it conveys a certain texture of emotion, if you like. As far as Bengali is concerned, I am told by scholars of Bangla that the tradition of scholarly study of, pre-modern Bangla that existed in Kolkata until, let's say, the mid-20th century, that is completely gone now. Apparently, it's now only kept alive in Dhaka. So, it's in Dhaka that it's being studied.
So would you both say that quite possibly the most interesting history being written now is in the vernacular?
It's perfectly possible, but I must say, I mentioned Sanjay Subramaniam, so I should say again that in my opinion, he is the greatest historian of my generation. I mean, his work simply because of this incredible linguistic ability that he has.
I would say not in the vernacular, but at least using the vernacular. Yeah, definitely so. I find it less or least interesting if the person has used only European sources in order to write a history of Asia or Africa or Latin America, and hasn't complemented it with additional ethnographic or other indigenous sources. Yeah.
But one has to say that the Dutch have been very extraordinary. No? Yeah, I mean, Knocker, what was his name? Yeah,
Must have thought you were
yeah, Dirk Wolff. Yeah, Dirk Wolff's book, Knocker Sepoy Rajput, I think it's a masterpiece, and really a sort of neglected masterpiece.
Thank you, Professor Akeel Bilgrami, for kicking off the proceedings of an absolutely delightful and fascinating evening. The huge numbers are testimony to how anticipated this was, and we could have carried on for a long, long time, except we have a small little closing ceremony now. On behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, the Mumbai Research Center, it is my pleasant duty to say thank you to all of you for coming here. Thank you, Professor Mahmood Kooria. Thank you, Amitav Ghosh.